Well, Spidey got his MCU trilogy, but it doesn't look like the Wallcrawler is done having MCU adventures quite yet. But with the clean slate he has now, what else is in store for him? Alright guys, if you haven't seen No Way Home yet, consider this your spoiler warning. As bittersweet as the ending of No Way Home was, what with Peter erasing everyone's memories of him, it does open the door for a lot of new story opportunities and characters to explore. This rings especially true to those that felt he was a bit too heavily tied to the Avengers as a whole and was starting to lack some of that friendly neighborhood street level charm that the character is so well known for. So let's ponder who Spidey could run into next, all the way from characters that have already been teased to pure wishful thinking. Look, I don't like to think about it any more than you guys do, but eventually Tom Holland is gonna have to hang up the Spidey suit just like the folks that came before him. And when that happens, it might be time to replace the character more so than the actor. And when it comes to talking about who could take up the mantle, well, there is a certain someone who has been enjoying a lot of popularity lately. And that someone is Miles Morales. Originally introduced in the Ultimate Marvel line of comics in 2011, Miles became the next Spider-Man after Peter died fighting the Green Goblin in an alternate universe. And while he was never a total unknown, he has fully entered the public eye in recent years thanks to his appearances in the Insomniac Spider-Man games and Sony's Into the Spider-Verse movie, and folks love him. Now, this doesn't mean that Peter has to leave the MCU in order for Miles to make an appearance. The two of them have coexisted in other media, and I'm sure we all want to see street-level Peter do his thing at least once before we bring in the new kid. But there could definitely be room to, at the very least, let him appear and set him up, and start one of those mentor-student dynamics that works so well between the two. And possibly give Peter an opportunity to outdo Tony on the mentor front. Because, aside from giving him tech and an earful now and then, Tony didn't do an awful lot of coaching, let's be honest here. And besides, Miles has already been teased twice in this setting. Not just by the Amazing vs. Electro, but also by a certain other character that I think a lot of folks would love to see in Phase 5. Hey, remember when Donald Glover played that guy Spidey tied to his car? You know, the guy who tries to give Peter some tips on how to be intimidating without Christian bailing the crap out of his voice? That guy's name is Aaron Davis, and not only is he uncle to Miles Morales, who he briefly alludes to in that one scene, he is also a master thief known in the comics as the Prowler. Well, a Prowler anyway. The original Prowler was a guy named Hobie Brown, but he's a story for another video. In the Ultimate Marvel universe, Aaron was indirectly responsible for Miles getting his superpowers after performing a heist on Oscorp and accidentally bringing back a genetically engineered spider similar to the one that bit Peter. The two's relationship is complicated in the comics, what with Aaron playing both the mentor and the villain, and their otherwise good family relationship is often at odds with their superpowered lives. Enough so that it also plays a huge part in both Spider-Verse and the recent games. With MCU Spider-Man likely focusing more on street-level superheroics rather than universe-ending threats from here on out, a story featuring Peter fighting a super thief and playing the positive mentor to a struggling Miles who's trying to find his own way could certainly be interesting, and work as a satisfying payoff to the setup while providing us with a new Spidey for the future. Except for the fact that, like I've already said, we've seen this story being told twice in just the last few years, so it runs the risk of feeling a little bit like old hat at this point. But speaking of setups that haven't had a payoff yet, when are we getting the goddamn Scorpion? Sorry, I'm really salty about this one. In case you don't remember the post-credit scene from Spider-Man Homecoming, and who can blame you at this point, Marvel clearly forgot all about it, Adrian Toomes happens to meet a particular crook when he arrives in prison. This is none other than Mac Gargan, the same guy Spidey fought against on the Staten Island ferry, and civilian identity of the longtime Spider-Man villain Scorpion. As the two bad guys shared a wicked grin, Homecoming perfectly set up the long-tailed terror's big screen debut. And then Marvel did absolutely nothing with it whatsoever. Mac Gargan is one of Spider-Man's oldest foes, originally being introduced way back in 1964, where he was the test subject of a process that would imbue humans with animal characteristics. Now enhanced with great strength and durability, as well as a robotic telescopic tail capable of shooting acid, Gargan became the Scorpion, and a long-time headache of Spidey's. It's true that he's not usually one of Spider-Man's most clever or ambitious foes, but he always at the very least makes for a visually cool fight, and it would just be nice to finally see him on the big screen, even if just as a minor obstacle in the opening act. Besides, the guy who funded his transformation into the Scorpion in the first place back in the comics? That was J. Jonah Jameson, so there's a lot of story potential there now that he's a more active player in the MCU. And I think we all want to see a little more of the pure majesty that is J.K. Simmons as Jonah. Either way, the wait for that tease to pay off is driving me completely crazy by now. Marvel, I'm begging you, please actually do something with this guy. Don't let him become another leader. Boy, remember when we all thought Kraven the Hunter was gonna be the third MCU Spider-Man villain before all the multiverse hype started? Those truly were simpler times. Yeah, it seems so long ago now, but that was a really persistent rumor at the time, and honestly, it would have made a lot of sense. Kraven, another classic Spider-Man foe introduced as far back as 1964, was originally a cocky big game hunter who had gotten bored of chasing wild animals. That is, until he heard of Spider-Man and came to consider him the only prey that was truly worthy of taking down in order to prove himself to be the world's greatest hunter. Given how Far From Home ended with Mysterio outing Peter's identity to the world and essentially starting a manhunt, the idea of someone potentially hiring Kraven to capture him seemed like a really good hook for a third movie. But, alas, it was not meant to be. He would have made for a remarkably different Spider-Man villain than what we've seen so far too. So far we've had a slew of mad scientists, victims of unfortunate accidents, folks with grudges against Tony Stark and obsessive villains, but we haven't had one that stalks the web-slingers simply to stroke his own ego. And since I know you're all already screaming about it in the comments, yes, Kraven is getting his own movie over at Sony in 2023, set to be played by Aaron Taylor-Johnson, so we'll get our burly Russian hunter in one form or another soon enough. But at this point, it's really difficult to gauge how that is even gonna work. Still though, it would have been really cool to see Spidey fight a dude wearing leopard print yoga pants over in the MCU. But, oh well, one can dream. Now let's talk about a character that absolutely nobody has ever brought up even once in any single Spider-Man discussion in the history of the world. Gwen Stacy. With MJ being the most famous of Spider-Man's love interest to the point of being the focus of both the Raimi and MCU series, even if the latter was short for Michelle Jones Watson rather than Mary Jane Watson, it can sometimes be easy to forget that Gwen Stacy was actually his first love. Some even considered it kind of a bold move to let her be the focus of the Amazing Spider-Man series over MJ back when those movies were new. But with Peter deciding to keep MJ and Ned out of his superhero life at the end of No Way Home, it would make for a perfect time to reintroduce Gwen. After all, it fits with the timeline. Gwen was first introduced in the comics after Peter graduated high school, and, well, college applications were a whole thing during No Way Home, so boom, perfect timing. Of course, there is the caveat that historically Gwen kind of dies in an encounter with the Green Goblin, as adapted back in the Mark Webb films, and given some closure in No Way Home. But maybe knowing about her fate in another universe could shake things up in the MCU. And as for Spider-Gwen, I wouldn't hold my breath. We've already talked about professional thieves and romantic interests, so why not bring in a fan-favorite character who's a little bit of both? Okay, a big bit of both. I am of course talking about Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat. As the daughter of world-renowned cat burglar Walter Hardy, Felicia trained herself to be an expert fighter and thief before making her debut as a costume criminal in the comics back in 1979. She then quickly developed a relationship with Spider-Man that has some surface similarities to a certain Caped Crusader and cat-eared whip-wielding jewel thief. I mean, come on. They're both cats, they both dress in black, they both flip-flop between being a villain, an anti-hero, or a full-blown ally. They both keep flirting with the hero, who always has to decide whether or not to bring them in for their crimes or let their, trusty sidekicks do the thinking for them. It's very similar. Still, Felicia does bring her own things to the table. For one, she has actual superpowers, being able to bring bad luck down on her opponents and enhance her own. That would be a pretty fun way to get some of that infamous Parker luck on screen. Plus, she's a thrill-seeker who's far more in love with the costume superhero side of Spidey than anything that exists underneath the mask, so that's a bit different too. It could actually be kind of fun to see her involved in a plot that already includes the aforementioned Prowler, with some kind of honor among thieves theme going on and planting many questions on the matter of trust. But I feel like writers would have to tread very carefully to avoid the whole Catwoman parallel thing, especially with Catwoman once again being featured in a recent Batman film. Unless that movie's version of her is super different than usual, who knows. Alright, so that's a couple girlfriends brought up, but what about some pals? We've gotten so used to Peter and Ned geeking out together, it's gonna be weird to see Peter get by without him. Who could he hang out with when he's not beating up bad guys? Well, why not Harry Osborn? He has, after all, been one of Peter's oldest friends ever since they started rooming together at college in the comics. He's also been fairly involved with Peter, MJ, and Gwen Stacy, so if the latter is introduced, then well hey, here comes Harry along for the ride. Of course, Harry has already had a tenure in both the former Spider-Man film series, both times ending up becoming the Green Goblin, much like he does in the comics with, I think we can agree, lackluster results. I can go a lifetime without having to think about this leprechaun-looking bastard ever again, thank you very much. And introducing him just to make him the Green Goblin again, especially after Willem Dafoe's Raimi Goblin just made his glorious return, would just feel like a whole load of the same old song and dance. But again, much like with Gwen, Peter having some knowledge of the two from another universe and trying to avoid having them meet a similar fate in his own world could potentially prove very interesting. Okay, so his status as Spidey's archenemy aside, Green Goblin is kinda played out in the movies by now, at least for a while. But if we can't go without introducing at least one Goblin at some point in every Spider-Man adaptation, then why not let the Hobgoblin have a go? If you're not familiar with Hobgoblin, I don't blame you if you take one look at the guy and write him off as a poor man's Green Goblin. And to be fair, that is kind of what it was introduced to be. The Hobgoblin was created in 1983 during a time where Norman was dead, Harry had reformed, and the lesser-known Green Goblin Bart Hamilton had bitten the dust as well. The editors at Marvel really wanted more Goblin stories, but then current writer Roger Stern really didn't want to undo what had happened to all the other Goblins or to give the costume to yet another rando. So he just created a new Goblin villain altogether. And he made sure that this new character, actually former fashion designer Roderick Kingsley, was quite a different type of villain from the Goblins that had been seen up until that point, being much more of a calculating career criminal than a giggling maniac. And then there's good old Ned, who in the comics is among the many people who have taken the Hobgoblin name, thanks to Kingsley brainwashing him and setting him up to take the fall should someone else uncover his schemes. This is a trick he likes to pull off a lot, by the way. I mean, there have been so many freaking Hobgoblins, you guys. And don't think we didn't see what Marvel did by throwing in one line where Ned promises to never become a supervillain and betray Peter in No Way Home. Oh, you absolute teasers over at Marvel. You just love toying with our nerdy little hearts, don't ya? Who knows? Maybe there's a Roderick Kingsley somewhere in the MCU who finds and reverse engineers some of Raimi Norman's leftover gadgets and starts a criminal career of his own. By now, the MCU is pretty densely populated with super criminals. We've got crime bosses like the Kingpin, who knows how many people Toom sold weapons to before it got arrested, power brokers peddling off-brand super serum to anyone who will take it, so on and so forth. And since the public can't always wait for someone like Spider-Man to show up, it doesn't sound totally unlikely that some folks would hire private mercenaries to hunt down criminals. Which leads us to Silver Sable and her Wild Pack. Silver Sable was introduced in 1985 as a mercenary from the fictional nation of Symkaria, who was often hired to deal with various supervillains by private contractors. Her militaristic approach to apprehending these criminals has brought her into conflict with the more traditionally superheroic Spider-Man on multiple occasions, making her function both as an antagonist and an ally, depending on who she's currently chasing, and whether or not she's been told the whole story by her employers. It's not like there's no fan demand for her character either. She was popular enough to get her own series in the 90s, she appeared in several animated series, and she had a fairly sizable presence in the PS4 game. Introducing her could also be a fun way to bring in more of the organized crime corner of the Marvel universe, like Crime Master, The Rose, Tombstone, Silvermane, Hammerhead, all of those guys. I think something like that could really bring Spider-Man back to his old neighborhood roots. Okay, you can stop tearing out your hair now. I saved one of the big guys for last. Venom. I mean, come on, do I even need to introduce him? This dark alien symbiote counterpart to Spider-Man has been one of Marvel's most famous characters since the 80s, and with his own movie series in the last few years, I'm sure just about everybody is familiar with the brain-eating, slithery-tongued black goop by now. And hey, with Tom Hardy's little dimension-hopping escapade between Venom Let There Be Carnage and Spider-Man No Way Home, there is now a little glob of symbiote crawling around somewhere in the MCU, so some version of Venom showing up eventually is all but guaranteed. But the question then becomes, who will be the host? Will it attach itself to Peter and then move on to an MCU version of Eddie? Well, maybe, that's the obvious choice, but we already had that story back in Spider-Man 3, and I can't imagine that Sony wants two drastically different Eddies running around in two different franchises. Mac Gargan was a host for the Venom symbiote for a while in the comics, but personally I'd rather see him have a run as the good old Scorpion first. And Flash Thompson, oh boy. The MCU version has had absolutely none of the character development that led to Flash becoming Agent Venom in the comics, so yeah, that's a hard no thanks from me right there. Venom did attach itself to a crook named Lee Price in the comics a few years ago, giving us an evil Venom once more, but that's obscure even by MCU standards. Also, that guy is already dead. These aren't the only potential hosts. Venom jumps bodies like the rest of us change socks, but man, this one is a bit of a mystery at the moment. Still, I don't doubt that cliffhanger will pay off in some shape or form eventually. That is, unless they pull another Scorpion. Just give him the freaking tail! But seriously, Spider-Man has accumulated such an insanely large cast that even if none of these characters appear in future stories, the series is not running out of candidates anytime soon. Who else is hoping for the fabulous Frogman to show up? Anybody? No one? Man, you guys are no fun.